I had tried to search my soul, but I could not, to save my life, figure out what I had done to deserve Laura's adultery. Yet it seemed I was doing most of the bending here. Still, I had to keep Alyssa's welfare fixed firmly in the center of everything I did. I would keep on down this path for a while longer for her. Good. I need you to remember whenever we talk that you are getting the layman's version of what are actually far more complicated issues. You asked me to talk to you on your first visit in terms that an engineer could understand, right? I'm trying to be true to what you asked for, and also to Laura's request that I be absolutely forthcoming and candid with you. I'm not saying you aren't smart enough to understand the myriad of cross-currents and conflicting emotions in the human mind, Mr. Archer. It's just that you don't have any training in my field. Although I think of myself as smart too, don't have a clue what vectors and force and gravity and stuff like that really means, okay? You do know what they are. It's part of your daily life. Your mind can get around those things while mine can't really. See what I mean? On the other hand, you probably have been sitting there thinking of sharing a simple definition of a vector, haven't you? I bet you could gin up one in just a few seconds more that would give me a definition my mind can process and use, couldn't you? But would that simple explanation be something the technicians and engineers working for you could use? No, I didn't think so. Do you see what I'm trying to do, and why some things might not ever become totally clear? I sniffed expressively and showed Dr. Jameson a wry grin. Okay, Doc, I said. You saved yourself with that last little bit. You know that, don't you? Young man, she replied with a serene smile. Why do you think you're paying me the big bucks? 3 weeks later. Honey, I think you need to do it. You've said yourself you and the doctor haven't made any progress for weeks now, right? I could have kicked myself. If you're enjoying my content, consider joining my Patreon community. By becoming a patron, you'll get access to full parts of my videos much earlier than everyone else. Plus, you'll be supporting me to create even more awesome content for you. Check out the link in the description to join now. I hadn't intended to use the affectionate term. It just sneaked out while I was trying to coax Laura into something she didn't want to do. Somehow, talking her into accepting a form of treatment she really didn't want to do had become my job too. I think the expression is grin and bear it. I did, but I didn't have to like it. Laura glanced up at me as we walked side by side across the grassy park. She was chewing her lip and had a worried expression on her pretty face. We were walking close together, but not touching. But it feels like such an invasion, she complained. I didn't like the petulant tone of her voice. For the first time in many months, I caught her by the wrist and pulled her around to face me directly. Her face flushed immediately. I knew my woman. She was excited by the first contact. The casual move meant more to her than it did me. I needed to make sure I wasn't misleading her. I looked around and found a picnic table under a tall cottonwood a short distance away. Releasing her wrist, I gestured toward the inviting shade under the tree. Look, Laura, I said as convincingly as I could. You say Dr. Jameson, and you agree you're not making any progress on discovering your reasons for doing what you did, right? She nodded. We reached the table. Laura sat on the bench seat and I straddled it, facing her. It was a good 15 degrees cooler here in the shade. Texas is hot in the summer, period. Then don't you think we need to get this whole thing jump-started? Shouldn't we agree to use anything we can to get the process going again? Laura looked out over the park with a troubled look. The wide expanse of thick grass, dotted with small clumps of trees here and there, was almost deserted at noon on a weekday. We had all the privacy we could wish for. I know, Laura said after a long pause, but it seems like putting me in a trance and digging around in my mind is so dirty that I don't know if I can do it. Please understand. Hanmark, I just don't think it'll do any good. How can you know that? I demanded. Laura winced at my tone and expression. She shook her head in protest. I just don't believe there's anything it will help, she replied defensively. She and I can talk a lot more. I don't mind that. I'm being as open with her as I can, Mark. I was silent for a long while. Laura was being stubborn, unreasonably so. I'd had a long telephone conversation with Dr. Jameson in which she asked me to press Laura to accept psychiatric hypnotherapy as hard as I could. She sensed there was something Laura was unconsciously keeping buried deep behind layers of concealment and denial. The doctor thought if she could bring whatever was troubling Laura up to the conscious level, Laura would be able to deal with it effectively. The doctor was sure there were a series of repressed memories, some hated experiences, or a bitter disappointment lurking somewhere beneath the surface. She said bringing them to the forefront so Laura's conscious mind would have to deal with them was the key to a resolution of her problems. I wasn't as optimistic, but it seemed to be a logical step to me. Assuming Laura wasn't being deliberately and consciously evasive, I was intrigued at what she might be hiding. "Laura," I said slowly, carefully, "I'm trying as hard as I can to be supportive in all this counseling and stuff. It's very, very difficult for me to do that if you aren't doing everything you can to explain to me why you had a goddamned 6-month affair with that." I had to take a deep breath and stifle an anger that wasn't very far beneath the surface whenever I focused about her unfaithfulness. I tried again. "I have to know why you made such an investment of your time and energy in your lover at my and Alyssa's expense," I told her. "Laura, if you leave it as it is, I won't ever have any kind of finality to this whole thing. What you will leave me with is a gnawing feeling that I've been had, that you picked some minor trouble from our past and built it up into an excuse to have it with a man outside our marriage. That won't cut it, Laura. Even if I was willing to set my humiliation and pain aside, that feeling, that doubt would ruin us later down the line. But we aren't ever going to get to that point, honey, because I am not willing to ignore the dishonor and pain, Laura. If you don't take this next step, you're choosing to end the marriage, honey." I stopped and watched as Laura put her forearms down on the picnic table and rested her head on them while she cried brokenly. I tried to be impassive, but it was hard. I almost told her I would take her daughter away too, but that's a cruel thing to say, much less do to a woman. I'd hold it back as the only trump card I had left, but I hoped I wouldn't have to play it. My daughter deserved better than to be used as a pawn. After a time, Laura's weeping subsided to the occasional sob and then faded away to nothing. She brought her head up to look at me from eyes drowned in harsh tears. She nodded her head vehemently. "Okay, Mark," she said unsteadily. "I'll do it." The anguish on her face was plain to see. "That's good, honey," I said, not minding the small endearment this time. "Will you come with me?" she asked, almost pathetically. She held her breath and held her body stiffly while she waited for my answer. I didn't hesitate. "Of course," I said, smiling gently. "Where else would I be?" I asked her. She smiled and caught my hand up in hers. We walked hand in hand back to my SUV. I didn't mind it nearly as much as I thought I would. A week later, Laura's marathon session with Dr. Jameson had been 3 days ago, on Friday afternoon. I'd been there, as I promised Laura I would be, but I wasn't allowed in the room with them. The doctor just would not allow that. One of the requirements for hypnosis, she said, was that the patient had to concentrate their attention on one person, and if I was in the room, Laura would be constantly looking to me for feedback. It just wouldn't have worked. So I sat in the waiting room and worked on memorizing the contents of 16 magazines on the rack there. When I woke up, I couldn't turn my head to the right at all. Laura had come out of the doctor's office ashen-faced and obviously shaken. She hadn't wanted to talk to me at all. Neither of them had. I was a little pissed off. I'd waited for 4 hours and nobody wanted to say a word. I knew the doctor and Laura had also met for a couple of hours on Saturday and a short while on Sunday, but I didn't know what they discussed. I was ready for some answers. "Good morning, Mr. Archer," Dr. Jameson said amiably. She sat behind her desk, leaning back in her chair and her elbows resting on the chair arms. Her hands were clasped comfortably across her belly. The doctor looked content, though Laura was far less happy to be there. "Mornin', doctor," I replied in a non-committal tone. I didn't know what was in store for this day, and I was on edge. "How are you today?" Fine, she replied. She looked at Laura and smiled gently. "You okay with what we discussed over the weekend, Laura?" Laura nodded, but she wasn't terribly enthusiastic about it. She wasn't speaking and had been uncommunicative when she met me in the lobby downstairs. We'd come up on the elevator together. Dr. Jameson beamed at the two of us. "Okay, let's get to it then," she said briskly. She looked at me for a long moment, and her smile faded a little. "Mr. Archer," she began slowly, "how much does a man with a degree in engineering know about the subconscious mind?" I shrugged. I read everything I could this weekend on the subject of hypnosis and the subconscious versus the conscious mind, right brain, left brain reasoning versus emotion, stuff like that. I saw that the subconscious is where we get our imagination and impulse. It's where human beings store memories and emotional feelings, right? The doctor seemed to be trying not to glare at me. I suspected she figured I had just enough knowledge to be of danger to myself. I had to admit, but only to myself, she was probably right. Still, I'd found enough articles on the web to be able to see where she might be heading in our conversation. Yes, she said at length. That's a pretty good summary of some of the major functions, she added. I was put in my place. She'd reminded me who was the expert here. I smiled faintly. Dealing with the good doctor was very similar to bargaining and negotiating contracts in the business world. If you didn't run across it in your research, hypnotism is a way for a therapist to get in direct contact with that subconscious mind, said the doctor. Hypnotism is a deep relaxation technique, a tool that I can use to bypass the reasoning function of our consciousness and get deep into Laura's experiences and her interpretations of those events. Memories and emotions are what we want to focus on today, she said. Specifically, Laura's memories of watching her father as he involved himself in a long-term affair with his sister-in-law, Ruth. She waited expectantly for me to respond. I sensed Laura was holding her breath. Okay, I said flatly. I really didn't know how I should react to that news. Yes, well, you know that Laura was born comparatively late in her mother's life. So late, in fact, that her brother is almost in another generation, correct? I nodded again. So for all practical purposes, Laura can be considered an only child? I pursed my lips and thought for a second or two. But there was nothing wrong with the logic, nothing that helped explain Laura's conduct either. I nodded. Okay, Mark, can you accept the fact that Laura adored her father very much and that her mother never totally accepted her in her life? Laura was something of an interruption in her routine. Not that she didn't love Laura, but she didn't quite know what to do with her. I'd been on a Dr. Jameson and Mr. Archer diet for a long time, but I'd forgotten why I'd insisted on her addressing me so formally. I let the more familiar use of my first name slide without comment. Yeah, I replied, I can't believe that. The first time I met them, I sensed a remoteness in Laura's mother. I was never really sure I had her attention even when she was looking straight at me. That impression didn't change much after a number of meetings. Dr. Jameson nodded. Anything more? She asked. Well, I said reflectively, her father was much the same. Except that where her mother was retiring, her father was almost belligerent in his aloofness. I always thought he liked to dominate his family and everything around him. I thought for a long moment. And, for what it's worth, I did see a certain closeness between him and Ruth. It was nothing too overt, nothing to comment on. But in retrospect, I can see there were signs that were closer than one would expect. I let more memories build in my mind. The curious thing is I don't recall Laura's mother ever objecting to Ruth standing closer than she was to Laura's father, for instance. I'd have to expect an affair lasting that long would not have escaped her notice, but she never reacted to it that I saw. I waved my right hand at the doctor to show her I was finished dredging up old memories. Correct, the doctor said shortly, but it's more than that. As far as Laura remembers, her Aunt Ruth took over much of the functions of a mother, while her mother confined herself to her poetry writing and the social club circuit. Until this weekend, Laura has successfully suppressed a deep-seated suspicion she is actually Aunt Ruth's child. A suspicion she is actually Ruth's daughter was one of the reasons she was so distraught when Ruth died. I digested that for a moment. I could see if I had been in Laura's place, that kind of confusion would eat at me. Shouldn't it be possible to find out? I asked, more or less rhetorically. Dr. Jameson nodded. As a part of Laura's treatment, her need to give herself some finality on that, she'll be asking for a DNA analysis. Her mother and father are balking Laura talk to them Saturday, but she and I have discussed the phone call, and we both came away with the impression their reluctance is more contrariness than anything else. I think they'll come around and we'll have a resolution to that fairly easily and relatively quickly. And indications are Laura will be able to set aside her fear she was Ruth's baby. I nodded. Sounds like a plan, I said irreverently. Indeed it is, Dr. Jameson said primly. But the waters get a little muddy from here on. she warned. Laura's father and aunt did not, apparently, think a young girl would understand and remember her father coming out of Ruth's room with his clothing disarranged and, on one occasion, undressed to the waist. In fact, although she did have memories from her earlier years, Laura didn't make the connection until she was a teenager and far more sophisticated than a 4-year-old. But she clearly recognized the signs of the affair by the time she was 13 or 14. Even then, it seems her father and aunt paid only slight lip service to attempts to conceal their relationship. The doctor looked at me expectantly. So, Mark, from your delving into psychology this weekend, what do you suspect Laura's subconscious mind did with those separate and distinct feelings? I tried to think. I wasn't sure what the doctor meant. Okay, Laura was unsure of her status within the family? I asked. Dr. Jameson nodded. Beside me, Laura stirred. So far, she'd allowed the doctor and me to talk without interruption. I turned my body in my chair to face her more directly. It was worse than that, honey, she said. There were lots of times I cried myself to sleep when I was in my teens because I didn't know who I was. Well, we'll know shortly, and then you can slay that demon, don't you think? I asked gently. Laura hesitated and nodded tentatively. I think so, yes, she said quietly. Good, I said confidently. One problem solved. So you also looked up to your father at the same time you knew he was doing something wrong? Laura nodded. I thought for a while. I held up my left hand, cupped as if holding a quantity of some substance. He was your father. You loved him dearly, but he was doing something that was hurtful. I lifted my right hand as if it held the hurt. You loved him. You hated what he was doing? Am I close here? I made juggling motions with my hands. Laura nodded, and I saw Dr. Jameson from the corner of my eye joining in the general nodding session. I frowned. I don't know where to go from there, I told the doctor. How does that tie into anything Laura is doing or thinking today? Dr. Jameson beamed. She was needed. Mark, did you come across a Professor Westermark and the process of imprinting in your reading? I hesitated. Something about birds being imprinted with the false idea that a human was one of their parents? Close, Mark. Some of the early studies into the concept of imprinting were done with animals and, more specifically, chickens, geese, and a few other species of birds. One researcher went so far as to fly hang gliders and ultralight aircraft with a flock of geese because the flying action of the ultralight mimicked what birds do on long-distance migrations. But it applies to human beings also. Your baby imprinted on you, as her father, and on Laura, her mother, probably within hours or days of being born. It doesn't stop there, though. A baby, then a toddler, child, teen, and a young adult do not stop observing and learning from their parents. Most of it is unconscious or controlled by the subconscious mind. You can think of the unconscious mind as mankind's connection with our instinctive, primitive, animalistic side. With me so far? I nodded my head shortly. Good. Now, remember, the subconscious mind is where we store learned behavior. Sometimes what we learn clashes with what we recognize later is good and moral. When there is a conflict, it creates turmoil in the mind, but it cannot always be resolved without intervention from the conscious mind. That's why people like me are around and why hypnotherapy is one of my most valuable tools. When my patient is deeply relaxed and focused on me, I can bypass the conscious mind and speak directly to the subconscious mind. Dr. Jameson seemed quite proud of herself. Her words were slow and considered. She was doing her best to explain things in layman's terms, as I had demanded weeks ago. Laura loves you, Mark, and does so very deeply. It's difficult for you to accept that now, and she understands that. You need to know also that she sees you as a very focused, dynamic, and forceful man. A very powerful one. That's not an exaggeration at all, from what I've learned about you over the past few weeks. Can you appreciate that fact, Mark? I knew I had a slight frown on my face. I was an engineer who had developed into a businessman. My position required some degree of hardness and ruthlessness, but I took great pains not to bring my job home with me. I understand it intellectually, I told the doctor. I glanced at Laura, but I'm not sure how that translates into anything dealing with our problems. I've never treated Laura or Alyssa in any way like I run my business. I made sure I didn't, as a matter of fact. That doesn't keep her from recognizing you as such, Mark, she said. She could not avoid seeing those qualities in you. If for nothing else but the fact that your company is frequently a matter for discussion by people in the business community here in town, and Laura was a part of that community until recently. I nodded my agreement. Okay, Mark, here's where things take a sharp turn. Dr. Jameson took a deep breath. Laura tensed beside me. Mark, you have to remember that logic, as our reasoning minds use it, does not exist in the unconscious mind, okay? I shrugged. She was the expert. Well, let's just throw it out there, she said. In her subconscious mind, Mark, Laura identifies your status in the community as equivalent or exceeding what her hard-driving father had when she was young. The doctor looked at me closely. Laura was watching my reactions intently, anxiously. Her fingers were twisting about each other with her agitation. I kept still for a long moment while I thought. I did not like the direction my thoughts were going. I cleared my throat. Laura sees me, or did see me, as taking her father's place? I ventured. The doctor shook her head vigorously. No, she said emphatically. It's nothing like that. Then would someone please explain it to me? I asked impatiently. Laura saw you as a hard-driving, a domineering man, as her father was, the doctor said slowly. But she also saw, on a deep level, it was vividly imprinted on her mind, that her father was having an affair. That was normal, if you will, in Laura's instinctive mind. I tried to absorb that. I turned to Laura. You thought I was having an affair? I demanded. That's why you were unfaithful? I was incredulous. My temper, and I have a bad one, was dangerously near ignition. Just what the hell made you think that? No, that's not it, Mark, Dr. Jameson interjected. I waited, half turned toward Laura but twisting around, so I could see the doctor too. You see, on an unconscious level, Mark, always remember it was nothing she consciously considered at all. Laura's instincts were telling her you should be having an affair. I didn't say a word. My mind was in turmoil. Dr. Jameson wet her lips. Mark, she saw that as what successful, powerful men did. If you had had an affair, there's every chance she would have looked the other way. If she'd caught you with another woman and could not ignore it, she'd have forgiven you almost immediately, no matter what her conscious mind was telling her. Her mother's acquiescence, or indifference, had already been implanted upon her too. I frowned. But you weren't cooperating, Mark, the doctor told me. You were so clearly not having an affair. Even Laura's subconscious mind could not interpret any late meetings, business dinners, or any of the myriad of business meetings as anything but exactly what they were. I looked at her stolidly. So, instead, she had an affair? I said facetiously. Exactly, Dr. Jameson said firmly. I could feel my eyes widen in shock. The doctor continued talking while an icy fierceness engulfed me. I struggled for control. Her subconscious mind knew, quote, unquote, successful, powerful families participated in infidelity. When you did not, I was on my feet without knowing I was going to rise. This is bullshit, I said carefully. There's nothing here but some crap designed to give my wife a free pass for screwing around and betraying our marriage. Not to mention me and our daughter. I turned and was through the door before Dr. Jameson or Laura recovered from the shock of my abrupt, almost violent movement and harsh words. I didn't stop until I was safely enclosed inside my big SUV.